So let's talk about the shape of a story. So remember, a story has got all these different parts, but where you put your emphasis, where you put your energy, how much time you spend in a particular part, it impacts how beautiful that story translates to the audience. Maybe something I didn't emphasize is this. There's two things we have to get right about storytelling. We have to design our delivery effectively. Secondly, we have to make our stories beautiful. Because if they are beautifully told, then they are remembered. If they are remembered, then they are passed down. If they are passed down, then the impact of their story lives through a longer period. So we have to think about exactly how do we shape the story so that it's got maximum effect. And we see this a lot in movies. Movies, sometimes, depending on the kind of movies, they'll spend very little time on the setup. They go into the confrontation, basically into the extraordinary world. It's there, it's happening, and then they close at the end. And some might spend a longer time in the setup. You know, there's slow movies, slow burns. It takes long to set up, and then suddenly the action starts, right? So we have to think about how we're going to shape our stories. And the key thing here is there's no one way of shaping a story. And to your own storytelling, don't fall in love with one way of telling a story. Think about the story itself, what impact you're trying to achieve, and then think about what's the best way to shape the story. But what you're seeing here is just an example of a typical shape of a story. This is typical. This is when you have very little time to prepare and you're just thinking about, oh, I need to get this done. This is your fail-safe shape. So first thing, you have to do a setup, but don't spend most of your time in the setup. Then you have to do the confrontation. The confrontation is all the stuff, the trials and tribulations, the dangers, the risks, everything that you are going through. And then you have to go through a resolution. And look at that resolution at Act 3. There's that line there where it says climax. It's that death and rebirth. After we've passed that, how do we resolve the story? And this resolution is what gives people satisfaction. Because after this drama of confrontation, of struggles, they want some resolution. So some key things to remember. When you do a setup, introduce the characters that matter, right? Not all the characters that were part of the story, some of them don't matter. Introduce the ones that matter. Introduce the setting. If you look at when I was telling my story, I described where we lived on the foothills of Drakensberg, surrounded by mountains on the border of Lesotho. And I described that setting that we were going to visit, a friendly, windy city, beautiful Port Elizabeth with pristine beach. So that's the setting of the story. And then once the setup is done, obviously I cross now into the extraordinary world, and that's where I discuss the conflicts I've dealt with, the problems, the risks, the dangers, anything that the trials and tribulations basically. And as I mentioned the slide before, we spend a lot of time here because a lot of what is happening here is the story. You know, the figuring out how to get a tire at 9 o'clock at night in the middle of nowhere because it's cold, you don't want to sleep there. That is the story. The challenges that you are facing is here. And most stories spend their time here, right? So this is 10%, the closer is 10%, so that gives us 20, and then 80% of the time is spent in this crisis here, in this up and down here, right? And this is where you find your humor. This is where you find your drama. This is where you find your suspense. Everything is happening here because we understand where you are, the setting you've given us, and then we are hoping that after all this chaos, you will resolve the story in the way that will feel satisfied. Remember, everyone in the audience is on your side when you are telling a story, right? And then the last thing here is then your resolution. Again, you're stepping down from the climaxing point and then you are resolving. So if I take it back to my story, the climax, the crisis point we were facing was that day 2, we can't find a lift. And the climax was when the angel appeared and looked at us and told us flat out, we're not getting a lift out of here. And so in that moment, probably all of our hearts sank, thinking, oh my gosh, this is just terrible. And then, unexpectedly, in a twist, because stories must have twists, right? It says, I'll take you. And then we didn't skip a beat. We jumped into the car and we left with him. And despite our mothers telling us never to go into a stranger's car, now they were there. We were all going to strangers' car. And they were probably saying, don't ask. Let's go to the stranger's car. And then that stranger resolved our challenge so blissfully until it got us home. And then once we were home, where the story ends, it is at a logical conclusion, satisfactory to the audience, because here is a family that was stuck in the middle of nowhere that through essentially a fluke has found their way home. They are now at home and essentially they are safe. So it's a normal conclusion. And you'll see also, I don't spend a lot of time describing home now, starting to say, so our house is built with face brick and it's got paint, it's on this street. No, it's the story is over. The word home is enough to describe the feeling. So in the resolution, you really wind down the story and you make sure you don't spend a lot more time on the story. Otherwise, you enter another story and waffle, and then we have to cut you, right? In fact, even the theory says you return home, right? Because it's your ordinary world. You found a way back to your ordinary world. So this is typically the shape of the story. And part of why this line is written sort of meandering like this is because when you are concluding or you are resolving your story, you're almost stepping down, and you maybe at this crisis point, your speech rate was high, the emotions were high, everyone was tense in the room. And so you're bringing them down slowly to say, oh, well, eventually, as we stopped in front of our gate, we couldn't, words can't describe the feeling we had to have finally gotten home and went inside. So you, even in your speech pattern, you are giving off the idea to the audience that we are concluding the story. It makes it more natural than when you close the story. So they don't feel like you've left them hanging somewhere. Right. So this is the typical shape of a story. And, before I just see if there's any question, in some movies, because movies, they're also trying to keep our attention and they want to be creative. Sometimes they start in the conflict. They don't even start with the setup. If you've seen those movies, the movie starts and they're already shooting at each other. You're like, what is going on? No one is telling you anything. You have no context. All you know is that one is running, that one is chasing, this one is shooting. You choose to yourself which one you're with. If you know what the movie is by Sylvester Stallone and is the good guy, you're already behind him, but you don't know the story. And then what they sometimes do is go back and do a little setup to bring you back into context, and then go back into the confrontation. Those are techniques. So that your storytelling is varied, right? But at the end of the day, for the story to be complete, there has to have been some setup to bring us into context, and then there has to be some confrontation, and then there has to be some resolution, right? So those three parts will be there. They might not follow each other sequentially all the time, because people are creative and they come up with all sorts of different ways to tell their stories. Any question on this? And then we're almost done, 2 more slides, and then we can take general questions and close. Umpile, go for it.
Hi, Laz.
Yes.
Yeah. I think for me, something that I always struggle with when especially when trying to follow this kind of a story setup, right, is trying to tell a happy story. Because if you look at the storytelling model and the shape of the story, it mostly points out struggles, problems, conflicts, and so forth. So then how would you then go about telling a happy story? There aren't necessarily any, problems that arise within the story. Everything went seamlessly. I know it might make for a boring story, if I could put it that way. But how do you tell a happy story that doesn't necessarily tick all the, conflict and the struggles and, you know, yeah, all of that? I don't know if I'm making sense.
I know, I get you. I mean, you sound like you've never had a crush in your life, you know? You know, a crush is exactly this. There's a setup, and you saw this guy. He was at the bus stop. He looked so good. We give us a setup, and then he looked at you, and he came over to you and said, "Hi, you've entered the confrontation now." That hi has thrown you into an unknown world because you don't know what to say to the guy. You're mincing your words, and the struggles. And I like that you bring that, because sometimes people, they think the struggles are a negative thing. Sometimes the struggles of happy emotions. So now you've got this overwhelming emotion of this guy who you have a crush on. He's asking you out, but you don't know what to say. And so you can be telling that. So he asked for my number, and I drew a blank, and I'm trying to find my own number. And so I give this guy my number, and then you can be telling a story. So he calls me, and then we meet up again. And this whole entire thing is a confrontation of you dealing with your emotions towards this guy. And they are happy emotions, they're not negative emotions. So your struggles of keeping them handled, because when we're in love, we can't keep our emotions handled. They are dropping all over the show. So that could be the struggle. In fact, if you look at romantic, rom-coms. Rom-coms do this all the time, right? Normal setting, the guy is going to work, he's working there in a suit. It's American movies, so they always have a cup of coffee in their hand, and then they bump into this other lady, right, who's also going to work. So they pick up the papers from the floor and they touch with the pinky, and then they look at each other. You see, setup done. Then confrontation enters, right? Now, the entire day, the guy can't stop thinking about that lady from the subway. The girl can't, So now they're already in this world, like this dating world. So then the lady maybe calls one of her colleagues and says, "Hey, how did you meet Josh?" You see, now he's looking for that mentor because she's looking for advice or some idea. She's just met this guy. She's feeling overwhelming emotions. She does not know what to do, how to think about it, whether it's something to even entertain, So she's soliciting a mentor, some advice. The guy then calls calls the guy, the patient through, is like, how did you get my number? It's like, no, I saw your bag. It was written Lazola Incorporated. So I Googled Lazola Incorporated's number. So now she's on the line with this guy. She's not prepared. She doesn't know what to say. The guy says, "Can you go out for dinner?" You see, so that's confrontation. It's the same sort of thing. They do that all the time. And then at the end, that story builds and builds and builds, and it gets to a point of climax where they are falling in love. There's, I don't know, Brian McKnight playing in the background, and the guy goes down on the knee and says, "Will you marry me?" And that's the climax. So if the rom-com was about girl meets boy, end up getting married, and then after he says yes, it kind of winds down, whether they show the wedding maybe a little bit, and then they show them sitting there with a baby on a yacht, and the movie ends. So it's same kind of thing.
Got you.
So just look out for that. I think to the point that Shanice also asked, the point here is not that the elements are not there in your own storytelling. We're just not aware of them because we don't associate our storytelling with some theories at this point. Because it's like talking, you're standing on the street corner, you're talking to your boys, you're just talking, hey, yesterday, you're not thinking, okay, climax, okay, this, okay, you're just talking, right? But then now we are here. Now there's people on this call who are trying to win $1,000. Now there must be separators. You got to think about, okay, how am I going to add an extra wow factor? How am I going to think about which parts of my story can be enhanced through the understanding of theory? So that's what we are trying to do with the workshop.